Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith. As you guys may know if you followed my channel for quite some time now, we actually have a very big history of doing comparison reviews. There's lots of people that want to know how camera A stacks up against camera B, and I appreciate you guys for all the comments because the comments let me know what types of content you want to see. And here lately, in my other comparison videos, the number one comparison that people keep on asking me about is the Canon Rebel T7i versus the Nikon D5600. Now, not long ago, we tested the D5600 versus the Canon T6i, and to my shock and amazement, especially in terms of video autofocus, those two cameras actually were pretty close to each other. However, now the Canon Rebel T7i has come out, and it has come out with some pretty big changes over the T6i, the biggest of which is the dual pixel autofocus technology. So a lot of people no doubt want to see how these two compare. The D5600 and the T6i were both extremely close. So the question is, how did these cameras compare? Well, stick around and we'll find out. Okay guys, so I'll tell you right now, spoiler alert, but the Canon actually wins this test overall if you ask me what is the best all-around camera. Now, that doesn't mean that the Nikon doesn't have its place, and there are definitely some places that the Nikon is better, but yeah, if you want the best all-around camera, I think the T7i is actually that camera to go with. Now, some of you might be shocked. A lot of people know that I'm a Nikon user, but really, I don't have any brand bias per se. I'm all about getting the right camera for the job. So why do I think the Canon is better all around? So let's see here. Let's first of all look at some of these specs. Now I'm not going to bore you with all this. And really, if you look at the specs, these cameras are very similar. They're both 24 megapixels. They both have the same ISO range from 100 to 25,600. The Canon gives you expanded ISO that pushes it up to 51,000, but I mean, that's insane. You'd never use that for any type of reasonable quality. They're both pretty similar now in terms of their video capabilities too. Whenever we looked at the T6i versus the D5600, the 5600 could do 1080p at 60 frames a second, and the T6i was limited to 30 frames a second. But on this new T7i, that's all changed. It too is now capable of doing 1080p at 60 frames a second. So once again, very similar. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you in a moment here some of the sort of things that the spec sheet doesn't necessarily tell you about how these cameras perform compared to each other. But there's a couple things on here that stand out that actually can be quite telling if we just look at specs alone. And the first thing, actually both these things really, have to do with shooting action photos. So yeah, if you're going to shoot action, it makes more sense to go with the Canon T7i because of these two things. And one of those things is just the fact that the Canon can simply shoot faster. The Nikon shoots 5 frames per second, and the Canon can do 6 frames per second. Now, one thing that I didn't really realize whenever I did my initial test on the 5600 was that the 5600 actually slows down depending on what image quality setting it's on. So say you want the best possible quality out of the Nikon and you switch it over to the 14-bit RAW, you actually drop down to 4 frames per second as opposed to 5. Whereas the 6 frames per second that the Canon manages is actually achieved in 14 bits. So yeah, it's yeah, it's not looking so good for the Nikon in terms of action photography. The other thing about the Nikon compared to the Canon in terms of action is the focusing system. Now, at first glance, they look very similar. The Canon has a 45-point focus system. This appears to be the same focusing system that sort of trickled down from some of the higher-end cameras, and it's basically the same sort of trickle-down situation with Nikon as well, where we have their 39-point focus system. The difference here, though, is that despite only small difference in points, 39 versus 45 is not huge. The thing is, though, the Canon has more sensitive autofocus. So basically, in focusing, we have these focus points that are called cross type. Those are more sensitive. So think like, low light action, your toddler is playing at Christmas time, opening presents and moving around erratically, the Canon is going to do better in those low light conditions because of its focus system. The Canon features an all cross-type point focus system, so all 45 of those points are the more sensitive type. The Nikon's focusing system only has 9 cross-type focus points, and those are pretty much more in the center of the frame and not spread out entirely, so its focus tracking is not going to be nearly as good. That's the main differences in specs that you can see, but I want to talk to you guys in more detail about some other physical differences I saw. In video, this is where things get particularly interesting. Last time I expected the Canon to basically completely win hands down in terms of autofocus tracking and autofocus performance. However, once I tested it, the Nikon and the Canon actually did very, very similarly. Now, going to this new T7i, we see an entirely different type of focusing system being used. This camera actually has Canon's dual pixel CMOS autofocus from the higher end cameras like the 80D. And what that basically means to you is that we have two types of focusing systems found in DSLRs. DSLRs focus very fast because they use something called phase detection, but that phase detection is used with the mirror. And basically, whenever a DSLR is in live view for video and that sort of thing, the mirror is in the up position and the phase detection doesn't work. So Canon, they've come up with this way to have that faster phase detect focus work directly on the camera's image sensor as well. So that way you get that fast autofocus even when you are in live view and doing video. The Nikon does not have that. It's limited to contrast detect focus, which is what you typically find in sort of a run-of-the-mill point-and-shoot type camera. So yeah, when we compare the focus performance between both these, the Canon does much better. It's much smoother. In the last video, I kind of asked you guys if you could tell a difference. In this one, I think we all can pretty easily see a difference in terms of focus performance between both these cameras. So that makes a huge difference as well. So if you're going to do video or action photography, that's 2 points in the Canon court. Now, there's some other things that the Nikon does better, I feel. And there's some other things that are going to be more personal preference, but those have to do more with the physical aspects of the camera. Let's go ahead and take a closer look, and I'll show you guys exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so taking a closer look at the Canon Rebel T7i and Nikon D5600, ergonomically, both these cameras are pretty much the same for the most part. Well, not exactly the same, but very, very close. They're about the same size. The Nikon weighs just slightly less than the Canon, and I've noticed that some people prefer this slightly deeper grip on the Nikon, especially if you have larger hands, but I've also noticed that some people don't like this. So my advice to you is to go out and get both these cameras in your hand and see what you prefer. But I have noticed that more people seem to prefer the feel of the Nikon for what that's worth. In terms of our connections, both these cameras have the same type of ports. Unlike the very, very bare bones entry level models like the 3400 and T6, both these cameras actually give you a microphone jack. Although it is worth mentioning that in order to get features like a headphone jack, Canon and Nikon both still want you to go up to something higher, like say a D7600, D7500, or something like a Canon 80D. So those features are missing, but you have to go to a little higher model to get that. In terms of controls, though, I have to give the slight edge to the Nikon there, because on this camera, there's two things that make it a bit different. We still have one command dial on this camera, just like the Canon. So we can go in here and we can use our dial to change shutter speed. We can press and hold our exposure comp, which becomes a f-stop adjustment. So the Canon is essentially sort of the same thing, but in reverse. Same mode on the Canon. You'll notice we have our shutter speed there, f-stop, press and hold, right there. So they both have one dial, but the Nikon has a trick up its sleeve. It has the touch function on the screen, so you can go in. By default, this function changes the viewfinder grid display. I like to go in here and change this to something more useful. like the, you could set it to the ISO, or my preference is aperture. So you can set that. And once we do this, if we're shooting, we still have our dial, do our shutter speed. But if we're shooting here, have it up to our eye, we can go like that. We're actually changing our aperture. So in essence, you have two command dials on this Nikon. The other thing that makes the Nikon controls superior is the fact that if we go in and we change something like our ISO, the ISO on this camera actually can be changed in third stop increments. Whereas on our Canon is set up to where we can only change our ISO in full stop increments. So a bit of a difference there. Now, basically, if you're a more advanced user, I feel like the Nikon's the way to go. I mean, yeah, you can obviously see here that we have a bit better controls. However, if you are a beginner, I think the Canon is actually more beginner friendly because we can do more with our scene modes. I'm not going to go through all of what you can do with the scene modes. Please take a look at my Canon Rebel T7i video, and I talk more in detail about that. But yes, just know that I find the controls here to be more beginner-centric. Okay guys, so in conclusion, you can see both these cameras are extremely versatile. As I mentioned before, the T7i though is definitely the better all-around camera. However, if you're going to do something that doesn't involve action and you want a little bit sharper results, you know, I feel like the Nikon does a bit better there. It doesn't have an optical low-pass filter, although it's worth mentioning that I think the Nikon kit lens leaves a little to be desired. So yeah, getting a good lens for the Nikon is a bit more critical, but with a better lens, which I suspect a lot of people will ask me about what better lenses you should get, and maybe that'll be a future video. But yeah, with the better lens, you can get a little sharper results out of the Nikon. If you're going to do something like portraits or landscapes, and you don't need the extra speed, I think the Nikon is the way to go. However, if you're shooting anything that involves, you know, moving subjects, I think the Canon makes a lot more sense in that regard. You get the more sensitive autofocus system with its entirely cross-point focus array, and you also get the ability to have a higher burst rate even when shooting a higher quality RAW setting. So that makes a big difference in terms of action photography. You also get much better autofocus performance in video mode on the Canon. Now, I feel like both these cameras produce some very good quality video. It's basically just, once again, it comes down to moving subjects. So if you're going to, you know, shoot moving subjects and you want your DSLR to behave more like a camcorder in video mode, the Canon, once again, it's going to make more sense there. The Nikon has an advantage in terms of its controls. So if you're wanting to do something like, you know, get into all the manual settings, I feel like the Nikon with its third stop ISO increments and the ability to use the touchscreen as sort of a pseudo rear command dial, I feel like that gives you some advantages in that area. Anyways, guys, write me in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. And no, I haven't forgotten about SnapBridge. SnapBridge has started working much better. We'll definitely be doing some more testing on that soon. Yeah, so write me in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on social media. I am known as Photog J the Great on all popular social media channels. And one new addition I've started to do now, if you would like to purchase either of these cameras, check out the links in the description below. You can head on over to Bedford Camera and Video's website. You know, they're making a lot of the newer videos I've been doing possible by allowing me the opportunity to get my hands on a wide array of gear. So if you'd like to support this channel, purchasing through the affiliate links below can make a big difference. Whenever you go on their site and you know, you're doing the checkout process, use the Great as the coupon code, you know, because I'm Photog J the Great. So it's kind of like saying, hey, Photog J the Great sent me. I'm using the Great code. Anyways, once again, guys, thanks for all the support. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.